Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Albert Arena, Director of the Waltham Museum, and today we have another one of our historical slideshows on Old Waltham. This one, as you can see, is called the Metz story. Most of you have heard that automobiles were made in Waltham at one time or another, and today we plan to tell you all about the circumstances involved in making the Metz automobile. Go to the first slide. This is Charles Herman Metz. He was born in Utica, New York in 1863 and during the Civil War. His father was an immigrant from Germany. At that time, when he was around 19, 20 years old, bicycling was sweeping the country. There was a bicycle craze, and Charles Metz got into the craze. He enjoyed racing bicycles, and he enjoyed working for a bicycle company, the Union Bicycle Company. At that time, they were using those big high wheelers. This was at the end of the 19th century, and he won several races in New York on these high wheelers. But he always dreamed about starting his own bicycle plant with him as the owner. In 1893, he heard that in Waltham, Massachusetts, they were putting up a bicycle racing track, and he thought that would be the ideal place to start his bicycle factory. He got some support from some local men, Herbert Thompson, an antique dealer, and the Howe brothers, along with some support from some executives of the General Electric Company. And he put up a plan on Rumford Avenue, makers of his Orient bicycles. He took the name Orient because he once worked for the Orient Insurance Company. And his bicycles were an immediate success. By the way, the plant was built by a local contractor named Robert Glancy, who also built the Mercantile Building and the Waltham Training School for Nurses. But anyway, his bicycles were an immediate success. They participated at the bicycle park, which, by the way, later became the Nipamar Park, and today it's still known as the Nipamar Park. But before the beginning of the 20th century, it was known as the bicycle racing track. It was a third of a mile long track, and it soon became known throughout the United States as one of the fastest tracks in the United States. Now on the right there, you see the starting gate. You did see the starting gate in the stands in the previous slide. And over on the left, you notice that shed. That's the Orient Bicycle Shed with the slogan, "Lead the Leaders." You can see some bicycles leaning against the fence. And that white oval circle around the group of people is the bicycle racing track. And over on the right, up in the hill where the chimney is the old Waltham Hospital, the old buildings of the Waltham Hospital. They're not racing bicycles today. Waltham High is having a football game. Waltham High played their football games there at around 1900. And when one of our slides shows the history of sports in Waltham, we go through all these sports events in Waltham. Another view of the bicycle park, racing track, can be seen from the south end of the park. At that time, around 1898, William Shakespeare and his son, William Shakespeare Jr., operated a bee hive operation, and they made honey there. And today, the street which makes the exit for the south side of Bicycle Park is called Shakespeare Road, in naming them for these two people that used to live there, the Shakespeares. Notice that you can see part of the track, and way in the distance is a bicycle racer, and some of the names of bicycle advertisements on the stockade fence. Now he put his plant up on Rumford Avenue, as I mentioned earlier, makers of Orient bicycles, and he bought a lot of land along with the land that had the building, and he named two of the streets, one the Orient Street, as you can see there, for his bicycles, and one Cycle Court. Now Cycle Court is still there, it's just a little parking lot now off Buttrick Street, but the Orient Street was absorbed as the Waltham Manufacturing Company expanded throughout the years. Now here's a view of the Waltham Manufacturing Company, makers of bicycles, at around the turn of the century. And here's an advertisement in the Review of Reviews, 1897, of an Orient bicycle. And here's another a poster of an Orient cycle with the slogan, "Leads the Leaders," made by the Waltham Manufacturing Company, Rumford Avenue. With this particular sales office was at the corner of 12th and Walnut Street in Philadelphia. Now, he made a number of different models of an Orient bicycle. This is obviously the Model 7B, a man's bicycle. He made women's bicycles, racing bicycles, all different models. And one thing you might notice, the circles in the sprocket. The sprocket's where the pedal is located. The circles represented O for Orient. And he made bicycles built for 1 and 2 and more than that. Here's the fork in the front of the Orient bicycle. It was one of the 22 design patents that Charles Herman Metz had on bicycles. His most popular one was the left-handed, right-handed thread, which is still used on bicycles today for the pedals of the bicycle. The porcelain plate says Orient, mile-a-minute bicycle, and the engraving around it says Waltham Manufacturing Company, Waltham, Mass. Here's a bicycle built for 2, obviously a man and a woman's bike. He made them for 3 and 4. And he made them for 4, 5. There's a 5 and a 6 and a 7. And he even made one for 10, a bicycle built for 10. You see right here. He called it the Ori 10. He took the word Orient and changed the last 3 letters as play on words, the Ori 10. It was a very popular bicycle, used in all the fairs, races, and other events. Of course, it was the largest bicycle in the world, and it held the record as the largest bicycle until 1966. The bicycle weighed 350 pounds, and with 10 men on board, they would carry a total of 2,000 pounds or 1 ton on 2 wheels. It was quite an engineering feat. The bicycle is now located in the Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. He made this around 1898 when the company was really doing good. In 1894 they made 1,500 bicycles. 1895 he went up to 7,000 bicycles a year. In 1896 he went up to 50,000. 1897 100,000 bicycles were built by the Waltham Manufacturing Company. They were doing real well. This is what the bicycle, 10-seater bicycle, looks like without anyone on it. And if you go to the Ford Museum in Michigan, this is what it looks like. Still another view of the 10-seater bike, the Ori 10. Now, one time they had 10 girls take the bicycle on a tour of Europe as part of a show business, and one of the acts in the show business, and they rode it around for the kings and queens of Europe. The only thing wrong with the bicycle, according to some of the men I talked to, is we had trolley tracks in Waltham, and when the wheels got caught in the trolley tracks, the 10 men would tumble to onto the road. Now, these multi-seated bicycles were first had a practical use. They were used as paces during the race. The race was the big thing, to make those single-seated bikes go as fast as possible. And the multi-seaters would break the wind. These paces would go ahead of the single-seated bikes, break the wind so the single-seaters could go faster. But along around 1898, Charles Metz decided to put a motor on a bicycle to act as a pacer, and he called it the Orient Motor Bicycle Pacer. And the pacer itself became an instrument for conducting races, and they started to race motor bicycles, which in effect was a motorcycle. He is one of the several people in the United States to claim to have invented the motorcycle in the United States. Now, as these races got more and more acceptable to people throughout the United States and more competitive, he went over to France and he hired a great French racer named Albert Champion, as you see here in the picture, the man on the left. And Albert Champion raced his bicycles, motorcycles, and 3-wheel motorized vehicles. He worked for the Waltham Manufacturing Company. Traveled around the country racing in the name of the Waltham Manufacturing Company and the Orient bicycles. Later on in life, Albert Champion would go on to invent the Champion spark plug, which we all can see today on the shelves in automotive stores. The Champion spark plugs, invented by Albert Champion, one-time racer for the Waltham Manufacturing Company. Now they're starting to put these motor bicycles into production along with their bicycles. And here's one of the first Orient motor bicycles with an Astor 3 horsepower engine, July 1900. Here's a photograph of pretty much the same bicycle. You might notice the word Orient on the crankcase of the engine. We acquired one of these motorcycles for the museum several years ago. Unfortunately, the seller wanted $7,000 for it. And here's a publication, an advertisement to buy the Orient motor bicycle, price $250. Now, as you can see, they're working up to the automobile. They're putting two bicycles together. They're putting two motorcycles together, trying to get a four-wheel vehicle for the general public. You have to try to remember everything during those days was horse and wagons, and these motorized companies were trying to take over the transportation business. In this picture, where they're testing out four-wheel vehicles, you'll see the woman on the left is Mrs. Metz. She's driven by Albert Champion. And standing up in the center is Charles Metz, and he's riding Stella Plaintiff, who was the sister of Gaston Plaintiff, the sales manager for the Waltham Manufacturing Company. Gaston Plaintiff would later go with the Ford Motor Company and be their top sales vice president for many years of the Ford Motor Company. On the right is his longtime friend John Robbins with the Derby on, who was also the superintendent and general manager of the Waltham Manufacturing Company. John Robbins would do a lot of the designing of the early automobiles, and as he did with the bicycles. They were once racing friends back in New York. Here they are going up and down the streets of Waltham testing out these 3- and 4-wheel vehicles. Actually, it was only one vehicle. It was possible to take off the front wheel of the 3-wheel vehicle and install the double wheel in its place to construct a 4-wheel vehicle, quadricycles. Now here's another earlier model. It's two motorcycles put together with a seat in between. It was one of the first Metz automobiles, runabout. You can see this Metz runabout in Sturbridge Village at their antique automobile museum. One of the first known, oldest known Metz runabouts in existence. Now, since he was supported by the General Electric executives, he tried his hands at making an electric car, as you can see here. And this was on exhibit at Madison Square Garden Automobile Show in 1899. He actually tried all modes of transportation at that time, as you will see. Now here he's trying out a 4-wheel vehicle using a Victoriette, which was a carriage type vehicle. He had it motorized, and here you see Mrs. Metz driving the Orient Victoriette, and the early use of the round steering wheel as opposed to a tiller. There were two types of companies, for the most part, that got into the automobile business. It was either the bicycle people like Charles Metz and Henry Ford, or it was the carriage people who made horse-drawn vehicles that would put an engine onto their horse-drawn vehicles, the horseless carriage, so to speak. Now, as I said, he tried all modes of transportation, including the steam vehicle, as you see here, his 1901 Waltham steam carriage. They only made one or two of these as prototypes, and they finally decided, of course, like most companies, to go to the gasoline-driven automobile. Now here's another model they were trying, the Orient Runabout. Now this particular picture of John Piper testing an Orient Runabout is on Bedford Street in Waltham. In the back you can see Hammer Street. And if you look closely behind Mr. Piper's head, you can see the old New Hall School, which is now the Winchester Crane Elderly Housing on Prospect Street. But this is the one they zero in on and decide to put into production, the Orient Runabout. And this, the second Orient Runabout, is introduced at the November 1900 New York Automobile Show. And finally, they do put this gasoline runabout into production for sale to the customers throughout the United States, along with their motorcycles and bicycles, of course. Everything is going very well for the Waltham Manufacturing Company, Charles Metz, and his owners. They had partial success with the Orient Runabout. Now here's a picture of Charles Metz in Lake Boom in Maine. He's the gentleman up front. His wife is next to him, sitting with her legs in the water. On the left you can see his friend John Robbins, the superintendent of the Waltham Manufacturing Company, still wearing his derby. And the man and the boy sitting on the raft is Robert Glancy, the contractor who built his factory, and the young boy, 12-year-old Warren Glancy. This was around the turn of the century. Warren Glancy passed away about 3-4 years ago at the age of 96. But he did some thinking up there at Lake Boone. He decided he wanted complete ownership of a company. So he went back to Waltham, and he broke away from the company, and he started his own company called the Waltham Development Company on Whitney Avenue in Waltham, makers of Metz motorcycles. Whitney Avenue was located behind between Jordan's and Woolworth's is, off Moody Street, little alleyway there. That used to be called Whitney Avenue. There used to be some factories back there. And he made motorcycles there, but he was his own boss. He owned the company, and he made other mechanical devices. He heard about a man in Brockton named Marsh who also made motorcycles, and he decided around 1905 to merge with Marsh. And they merged in 1905 and formed the Marsh Metz Motorcycle Company, working out of Clarendon Street in Boston. Here you can see their sales office at 207 Clarendon Street in Boston. We looked up where this location was. Obviously the building's long gone, but it's directly across the street from the huge Prudential Tower. But here they sold bicycles, motorcycles, very famous motorcycles, the Marsh Metz motorcycles, which are collector's items today in the motorcycle clubs. He also meets Roscoe Pickens, the gentleman in the center, who was the sales manager for the Marsh Metz Motorcycle Company. They would become lifelong friends and correspond with each other till he dies. The showroom of the Marsh Metz Motorcycle Company, 1908. And this is what they look like, the Marsh Metz Roadsters. Meanwhile, back in Waltham, John Robbins is still there as the superintendent, and they have a new president, Leonard Gaylord. But they come out with a second motorized vehicle called the Orient Buckboard, as you can see here. It was a horse-drawn vehicle, a buckboard, and they attached the famous Orient name in front of it. And they, in effect, had another horseless carriage. The engine, the 4 horsepower engine, is located between the rear wheels. It was a very fine and successful vehicle. However, it didn't have reverse, and for the operator to turn it around, he would have to get out of the car, pick up the front, and swing it around. One of these Orient buckboards, 1903 Orient buck, is on display in the Waltham Museum. Now they were producing 2 cars. The old Orient Runabout, which we talked about earlier, is called the Orient Motor Car, selling for $950, and the Orient Buckboard is the second vehicle, selling for $500. This is 1903, along with their motorcycles and bicycles. But right along this time, they're starting to drop their line of bicycles and concentrate on automobiles. And they'll be dropping their motorcycles also along 1903, 1904. And they were concentrating on automobiles such as this, the Orient Surrey, the 4-wheel vehicle, which similar to the the Surrey used in horse-drawn carriages. Sold for $450 without the top and $475 with the top. They made the touring car, the touring runabout. Now here they're trying to get more horsepower. As you notice, there's 16 horsepower there. They've combined the 4 horsepower single-cylinder engine with 3 others to make a 4-cylinder 16 horsepower. This is going to prove to be a mistake because they're still relying on air cooling for these larger horsepower engines, where they should be going to water-cooled engines. It was all right for 1 or 2 cylinders, but not for the multi-cylinders that they would put on these other cars, such as the Orient Limousine. And a cute little vessel. This was made in Waltham, of course, by the Waltham Manufacturing Company. It had 4 cylinders and 20 horsepower. Sold for $3,200, but they didn't sell too many of these because in the summer they would overheat, since they didn't have water cooling. Likewise with the Orient Light Touring Car and the Deluxe Touring Car, made in Waltham around 1906 and 7. Sold for $2,250. The only ones we were selling were really the Orient Buckboard because it was reliable. And the last year they made the Orient Buckboard, as you can see here, was 1908. And here's a picture of one. This particular one you can see down at Heritage Plantation Museum in Sandwich, Mass. It's really exactly like the 1903 one, except they added a running board and a hood-covered box in the front to make it look like there was an engine there. Actually, that red box is just a compartment, empty compartment to put luggage in. So if you're down at the Heritage Plantation Museum, you'll see the last of their Orient buckboards. They sold about 500 of these each year for the past 5 years, and it was the only vehicle that was making money for the Waltham Manufacturing Company. All the others were losing money, mainly because they were air-cooled. Now meanwhile, because of the reliance on the many air-cooled automobiles, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. And they called Charles Metz back to take over the bankrupt company to see if he could salvage it. Leading the people to ask Charles Metz to come back was P.P. Adams, who operated P.P. Adams' department store in Waltham. So Charles Metz did come back, and he had complete ownership of the company. He changed the name of the company from the Waltham Manufacturing Company to the Metz Company. And he had what he wanted, the ownership of the company, as I said, along with the bank, of course. Now he surveyed the situation. There were only 10 employees left. As I said, they were on the verge of bankruptcy. And he had numerous parts from all these Orient automobiles that were unsuccessful. And he had to figure a way for the company to get back in the black without expending too much money. So he came up with the idea of a Metz plan car. He would sell cars as kits, 14 individual kits for $25 each. And that way you wouldn't need too many men on hand to produce the automobiles. You could just wrap up the kits in packages and sell them to customers throughout the United States. And this way he got rid of all the old parts on the shelves and at the same time had money coming in. It was a chance that he took, and it worked. However, when he mailed out his first kit, he didn't exactly know how the car was going to be put together at the end. He did know he would use the chassis of the Orient buckboard, which had a successful chassis, and the auto body style of the DLR Runabout, one of the last air-cooled cars that the old Waltham Manufacturing Company produced. Anyway, this is the statistics on the old Metz plan car. On the left is the 14 kits, and on the right is what the car eventually looked like that was sold to customers throughout the United States. It was, as I said, turned out to be a success. Money kept coming in, and the company was now back in the black. This is the 1909 two-cylinder 10 horsepower Metz plan car, as appearing in their first sales literature. This is what their plan car looked like. To those mechanics out there, this is what the chassis look like. A two-cylinder air-cooled engine which drove a friction drive transmission to two chain-driven wheels for power to the car at that time. A friction drive was an unusual method of transportation. Most cars at that time had standard gears. Only the Carter car, the Sears Roebuck car, and the Metz car had a friction drive. We'll be talking more about the friction drive Metz cars as we go along. And a two-cylinder air-cooled engine, a front view of this two-cylinder air-cooled engine, and a rear view. Now, this is a photograph of some of the Metz test drivers working on a two-cylinder air-cooled engine. As you see in front of them on the bench is a two-cylinder air-cooled engine. We do know a few of the names. John McGann is on the left, and 18-year-old Pat Moorhead is the second one on the left. We were fortunate to meet Pat Moorhead later on in life at the age when he was 84 years old. Once again, 1910, they continued their planned car policy, which kept money coming in, and they kept them hiring new employees and getting ready to produce factory-made automobiles. Now, there's collectors of automobiles throughout the United States, antique automobiles, and here we see Terry in Terre Haute, Indiana, Jim and Virginia Shaw, who owns this 1910 Metz plant car. At that time, we thought it was one of the oldest cars, Metz cars in the United States, but we've since learned that there were other older plant cars. And this is what the Metz cars look like, or any antique car looks like, when the collectors find them in the back barns of Oklahoma or in foreign countries, Australia, wherever they went, and they try to restore them to their original condition. Now, these two are the two oldest known plant cars in existence. They're owned by a Miss Kathleen Burkhart in Connecticut, and the two of the earliest plant cars that were sold as kits. They're very cute. There were two different types of wheels, you might notice. They had the artillery wheels on one car and the wire wheels on the other. These are two beautiful little plan cars. In 1911, the Metz company stops the plant car policy and starts assembling all the cars in the factory, as you can see here. Here's a picture in 1911 of some of the executives and workers of the Metz plant. The only one we know is sitting on the second on the left, the fellow with the bushy hair, is August Hensey. He was foreman of the tool room for the Metz company. His son Norman Hensey donated these pictures to the Waltham Museum. Now, over on the left you can see August Hensey. He was foreman of the tool room of the Metz company. We know all these names of all these employees, but we won't spend the time with them right now. It's still August Hensey on the right. To give you an idea of what the factory looked like. This particular case, it's the tool room. August Hensey. They started to diversify a little bit by putting a barrel to the rear and using it as a special delivery car. Carry 500 pounds. Once again, here's a 1911 two-cylinder Metz factory-made plant car, owned by someone in Florida. Now, things are going so well for the Metz company that they buy the Governor Gore estate. It's not the Governor Gore estate at that time. It's owned by private individuals. It will later become, of course, the Governor Gore Museum. And he puts white stucco on it, and he uses this building as his home and his office. He also uses it for an airplane field, the field outside, and he uses part of one of the rooms for the Metz Aerodrome Clubhouse. Because he's thinking of getting into the airplane business. Henry Ford was similar to this. Henry Ford tried to get into the airplane business, But Henry Ford was unsuccessful, and of course Metz will prove to be unsuccessful as far as the airplane business was concerned. But he did put out a brochure, and he did make some Metz air cars, which he called them. They were similar to the Blériot airplane made by Louis Blériot of France. And he promoted one of the first airplane meets in the United States on the Governor Gore estate. And great aviators from all over came to this airplane meet on June 15, 1911, to perform and try to win that $50,000 prize. And one of the leading aviators was Earl L. Ovington of Newton. He was from Newton. That's his crew there. In front of his Blériot airplane. This wasn't a Metz air car. This was an actual Blériot airplane. The original Blériot, by the way, is in the Smithsonian Institute, Washington, D.C. But on June 15, 1911, Earl L. Ovington took off at the Metz Aerodrome and successfully flew over Waltham. It was the first successful plane to fly over Waltham. He continued on over Cambridge and the State House in Boston. And it was the first plane to fly over Boston. As a matter of fact, the legislators, which were in session, ran out to the balcony without formal dismissal to see the first plane flying over Boston. He turned around, and 37 minutes later he landed back at the Metz Aerodrome in Waltham. Here is Earl L. Ovington in his Blériot airplane. It was quite a thing with these planes. They'd come in the morning, they'd be disassembled. They'd come in on either horse and wagon or an earlier truck if they had a truck that could do it. And they'd assemble these planes in the morning with bolts and nuts and so forth, and the aviators would go up in them in the afternoon to perform in front of the crowd at the airplane meet. It was a very dangerous thing. As a matter of fact, two of the pilots that performed at this airplane meet were killed within several years after the airplane meet. But crowds, as many as 8,000, gathered to watch the airplane meet, which went for seven days. It was quite an event. This is the Burgess Wright biplane used by Harry Atwood, another pilot. Harry Atwood flew to New Hampshire on this plane from the Metz Aerodrome. Then there was Mr. and Mrs. James Martin of the Harvard Aeronautics Society. Here you see a postcard. It says Metz Aerodrome, Waltham, and Watertown. That's Mrs. and Mrs. James Martin Farnham biplane, they called it. Now, late in 1911, after the airplane meet, they entered the Glidden Tour Race, which was a prestigious race between all the automobiles in the United States, see who had the best automobile. And here's the Metz team of 3 cars. In the first car, the 15 car, is Charles Metz, and the driver's that 18-year-old Pat Moorhead we talked about. And the race would go from North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. And the Metz company came in first, second, and third. Unfortunately, they were disqualified. Well, they lost 9 points because they used a horse and wagon to get across a stream, which they were not allowed to do. They were supposed to conduct the race completely on their own. It just so happens that that's car 15 with Charles Metz and Pat Moorhead in the driver's seat. So they didn't win that race in 1911. Here's a cutaway of a Metz automobile showing the friction drive. The big steel disc, as you can see, is driven by the engine. The engine in turn would drive the rubber wheel, and the rubber wheel would drive 2 chains for the rear wheels, and that's the mode of transportation for the Metz automobile. A closer look at a friction drive is seen here. It's located directly below the seat. You pick up the seat and you can see the friction drive. Now when the rubber wheel's in the center, the car is in neutral, and when it goes one direction, the car goes ahead, and when it goes in the opposite direction, it goes in reverse. And that was the friction drive. Now in 1912, Metz comes out with a 22 horsepower automobile, a 4-cylinder water-cooled engine driving this automobile. He learned from the bad experience of the old Waltham Manufacturing Company that when you go to 4 cylinders you can't cool it with air. And it was another successful move by the Metz company, builders of this beautiful Metz 22 1912 automobile, Waltham, Mass. And once again, for you mechanics out there, this is what the chassis looked like. And this is the 4-cylinder water-cooled engine. It's very similar to the Ford 4-cylinder engine, used on the 1912 Model 22 Metz automobile. And this is what the 1912 looked like. Beautiful little car. As a matter of fact, the 1913 and 14 look pretty much the same thing. At the Waltham Museum, we have a car very similar to this, a 1913. Looks pretty much the same as this car. 4-cylinder water-cooled engine, Model 22. Now things continue to go very well for the Metz company. And on their brochures, they show this Metz automobile, the new one, the Model 22, in front of its Rumford Avenue plant. Another 4-cylinder Metz Roadster. No, you might notice a seat in the rear. They didn't call it a rumble seat at that time. They called it the mother-in-law seat. Here's an owner of a 1912 Model 22 Roadster. Lives in New York. Paul Hines of Charmont, New York. Here's a 1913. They continue the same model in 1913. Now in 1913 they entered the Glidden Tour race again. And driving one of the cars is Walter Metz, Charles Metz's youngest son, Walter Metz. He had two sons, Edward Metz, the oldest, and Walter Metz, the youngest. And here he's taking a message from the mayor of Boston to the mayor of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the race is going to start. The race is going to go from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Salt Lake City, Utah. Now here's the three cars ready to start the race between Minneapolis, Minnesota and Salt Lake City, Utah. In the front seat is Charles Metz again, but this time Pat Moorhead is not there. The car is driven by John McGann. Pat Moorhead had joined the Army, became a sergeant in the Army. But way on the left, standing up, you can see Walter Metz, 18-year-old Walter Metz, who was driving the car 7. Walter Metz, at the age of 90, would later come back to Waltham. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But they won the race. Well, there's Walter Metz there. Once again, they won the race. They came in first, second, and third. And they came back to Waltham. And the mayor of Waltham set a day aside to celebrate the prestigious victory of the Metz company over all the other competitors in automobiles in the United States. They won the Glidden Tour Trophy in 1913. The three cars held a perfect score. And that's the Glidden Tour Trophy. Trophy everyone wanted to win because it would help sell cars as well as being something to be proud of. Now, two girls working at the Metz building, at the Governor Gore building, as secretaries, also took a number of pictures and were in all the publications put out by, and catalogs put out by the Metz company. They were the Havey twins, as you can see here. And here they're advertising the winners of the Glidden Tour race on the Governor Gore estate. Here they are again, one of the publications. The unusual thing about up until last year, both girls were alive. They were both 95 years old, living at the De Vincent's apartments. However, one of them passed away last year at the age of 95. But 1914, late 1913, in all his publications, Metz announced that he was the winner of the Glidden Tour, and his cars were selling very well, as you can see here. That's the 1913 Model 22. The 1914 Metz Model 22. Turtleback, they call this one. And once again, an old car about to be restored. The Metz 1914 Roadster. Wooden artillery wheels. Some were wire wheels, some were wooden artillery wheels. Now here is the Metz taking their picture. On the right is Charles Herman Metz, the founder of the company. On the left is his father, who came from Germany, Wilhelm Metz. In the center is his oldest son, Edward Metz. He had two sons, Edwin and Walter. And the little baby is Edward Metz Jr. The baby is now about 75 years old. He lives out in California. But they were very happy. Everything was going very well for the Metz Company. They had a wonderful plant on Rumford Avenue. It's a view of the workers that worked in the Metz plant. Here's a view of this assembly line. They put the cars together. Here's a view of the draftsman working out of the Rumford Avenue building. On the left is Frank Jones, who donated this picture. Some of the names are familiar in Waltham. H. Hamill, E. Hood, R. Comstock, Stanley Wokes, who started the plumbing shop on Felton Street, which is still operating. O. Freeberg, A. Chandler, and Philip Abbott, who started Abbott Motors on Linden Street later on, seller of Ford motor vehicles. They were all draftsmen for the Metz Company. The leader of the Metz draftsman was George Jessup, who would later join with Francis Davis to invent power steering in the United States. There's a drawing of the new Metz plant. With the success they're undergoing, they put up another building, a sawtooth building, off of between Gore and River Street in Waltham. The building is now occupied by the Raytheon Company. It's known as the Lever Building with the Raytheon Company, but it was the Metz Company who put it up in 1914. He put it up on the airplane field, the old airplane field, because he gave up on building the Metz air car and concentrated on automobiles. I'll see several pictures of this sawtooth building between River Street and Gore Street on Sion Street today. This is on a postcard. It acted as the auto body shop. The chassis would be made over at Rumford Avenue. The chassis would be driven through the streets of Waltham 1 mile to the auto body shop at the Sawtooth Building, where the bodies would be put on. And then they would be shipped out by train from this location. There you see the Sawtooth Building again, and the train taking the automobiles to the customers throughout the United States. Notice the Governor Gore estate in the background, which was his home and office, as I mentioned before. He also owned a building on the corner of River Street and Sion Street, which was his upholstery and top shop. That building is still standing. With things going so good, he's right sitting on top of the world, as shows in this picture, but actually this picture was taken at the Grand Canyon, because it was a Metz car that was the first car to drive to the bottom of the Grand Canyon and back up again. In 1914, he installs electric lights on some of his models. He calls it the Model 22 Speedster. Here's a photograph of the Model 22 Speedster. But he still has, many of his models still have gasoline lights with the gasoline tank, the gas tank on the running board. But middle of 1915, he completely goes to electric lights on all his models, as you can see here. This is another one of the vehicles we have at the Waltham Museum. Not this particular one, but we have a 1915 Model 22 Metz. This was his greatest year. He made over 7,000 cars in Waltham. He was the greatest producer of automobiles east of Detroit. He was sitting on top of the world. He had all these plants in Waltham, anticipating years of production. Here's his board of directors. Charles Wolfe on the left, the treasurer. Edward Metz, his oldest son, was the sales manager. Charles Metz was the president, of course. John Robbins, the superintendent and general manager. And Charles Spielberg on the right. They were sitting on top of the world, anticipating years of production, but then something would happen on May 7, 1915, that would put them out of business. and that was this here. The Germans sunk the Lusitania submarines. 1,260 were killed, torpedoed twice, off the coast of Ireland. And people in the United States and throughout the world were furious at anything German, the Germans and anything German. And they didn't want to buy a Metz car. Although, we can say that now, at that time he didn't realize what was happening to his company. In 1915 he puts out, 1916, excuse me, he puts out a Model 25 Metz. And this is a wonderful brochure he put out, anticipating a big demand for his automobiles. That's the front cover. That's the rear cover of this brochure. But no one's buying this. Well, this is the end of the 1915. It was his best year. But in 1916, no one would buy his cars. Oh, we're still in 1915. That's the touring car. A photograph of the touring car. 1916, putting out a wonderful car, winning the Glidden Tour race years ago. 25 horsepower, both touring and roadster automobiles. He even puts out a few trucks, Metz 25 commercial trucks. As you can see here, there's one with P.P. Adams on the side, delivery wagon. But no one will be buying these automobiles and trucks only because of the name. He feels that maybe he needs more dealers. So in the Popular Mechanics, he puts an ad calling for more dealers of Metz cars throughout the United States. But we have more photos of 1917 of the tool room with August Henze still there. Tool room in 1917. Things are starting to get a little rough for the company. Although they're putting out a very fine automobile, no one's buying it. Now in 1918, of course we entered the war in 1917, the United States entered the war against Germany. In 1918, the feeling was so strong against Germans in the United States, similar to the way it was towards Japanese during World War II, that the government came in and took over the Metz plants and made airplanes for the war effort. They made 1,000 de Havilland DH-4 airplanes and 108 Hadley Page airplanes in Waltham. This is what the de Havillands looked like. When the war was over, on November 11, 1918, the employees of the Metz company took one of these planes without the engine and ran through the streets of Waltham celebrating the end of World War I. In 1919, they gave Charles Metz, the government gave him back his plants, but they never paid him for that year of use. They made so much red tape for him, he never got paid for it. So he was on the verge of going bankrupt. He was struggling. But he managed to come out with a Master 6, a six-cylinder vehicle, as you see here. But he was forced to use second-hand parts. And it had a reputation in 1919 and 1920 of being a bucket of bolts, which it was, a poor car, unfortunately. So he struggled in 1919 and 1920, where he only made one or two cars. And finally, in 1922, he realizes it was his name that killed the business. So he changed the name of the car to the Waltham car, but it was just too little too late. Only sold about 35 of these cars, and Metz went out of business, the Waltham car. And they all picked up, the Metz family picked up, and they moved out to California. Just so happens that Edwin Metz, his oldest son, took the last car off the assembly line and drove it out to California, the last Waltham car. Later on, through the years, he kept the steering post of that last car, and eventually he gave it to certain people and got back to the Waltham Museum. It's on exhibit at the Waltham Museum, the last steering post of the last Waltham car. Now this is not too clear, but it's Metz specifications. Tells you exactly what the serial numbers were for all the cars throughout the years, the colors, the dimensions. We won't dwell on that. But that pretty much, we're coming close to the end of the slideshow now. Here we're going to review now. This is the Metz Orient family tree. The story we've been trying to tell you, how in 1893 he started up as a bicycle plant, went on to motor bicycles or motorcycles, tried electric cars and steam cars, left the company to join Marsh, making the Marsh Metz motorcycles, came back to the company, tried to make Metz air cars, was very successful until 1915, when of course the war effort put him out of business. In 1922 he tried making the Waltham car, but that was just too little too late. Now but you don't have to feel too sorry for him, because he got into the building trade. He was a graduate of MIT, as were his children. He got in the building trade out there in California, and he became a multi-millionaire. He put up homes in the Malibu area during the early part of the century. But he always dreamed about coming back into the automobile business. Here at the age of 70, in 1935, he carved this little model out, and he wrote to Roscoe Pickens, the friend he met back at the old Marsh Metz motorcycle company, with the idea of coming back into the automobile business. But they were sort of just two old men dreaming of coming back into the business. And 2 years later, at the age of 72 in 1975, he would die and be buried in California. Now here's an aerial view in 1921 of the area he left. He would be leaving. If you look closely, you can, in the first block, you can see the Governor Gore estate. And that oval-shaped ring there was Old Central Park. That's where Waltham High also played their football games there, 1906. It was also where Buffalo Bill's Wild West show came in 1898 to perform. And of course, the building on the left is the Sawtooth building we've been talking about, where Raytheon is today. You know, Waltham was quite a place during the turn of the century. If any city in the United States exemplified the 19th century to the 20th century style living, it was Waltham. They had bicycles built for two, they had horseless carriages, and of course the flying machines. Songs were written about all these events. They had the Wild West shows, the company picnics put on by Waltham Watch Company and various other companies, the band concerts at either Robbins Park or on Waltham's Common, and of course the river festivals with their canoeing and swimming on the Charles River. It must have been quite a place to turn the century, Waltham, Massachusetts. And Waltham, Charles Metz had a lot to do with this great 30 years of exciting living in Waltham. Now, a couple of side notes. One of the drivers, Reggie Thomas, after the company went out of business, became a lieutenant in the United States Air Force, and he landed in 1925, he landed his seaplane in the Charles River in Waltham to greet all his friends. Now, whatever happened to the old Metz building? Here we see, it was the Waltham Manufacturing Company building. Here's a postcard of the Waltham Manufacturing Building. By the way, the huge door on the right and the ramp coming down is how they got the cars started. The earlier cars in the 1900s. They'd go down that ramp to get them moving fast, get them started. I'll tell you what happened to that building. In 1970, it was owned by the Perrine Battery Company in Waltham. And on March 18th, 1970, Waltham's greatest fire occurred when the old Waltham Manufacturing Company burned to the ground. The largest fire. In one of our slides shows the history of the Waltham Fire Department. We cover this great fire, of course. Now, some of the old timers coming back to the Waltham Museum. We talked about Pat Moorhead. There he is right there on the left with Ed Hensey, another employee. Ed Hensey was the younger brother of August Hensey, who was the foreman of the tool room. Pat Moorhead was from Farmington, Maine, and he would pass away a few years later. Frank Jones was the draftsman. He's sitting in the Orient buckboard at the Waltham Museum. He was a draftsman we saw in that draftsman picture, and a very fine gentleman who would pass away. Now, many of these slides the pictures came from an article written by Frank Tucker on the right, who is an authority on the Metz company, and he wrote these articles for antique automobile magazines. Here he's interviewing Edward Metz Sr., the oldest son of Charles Metz, in 1966. And then we were fortunate enough to meet Walter Metz when he came back to Waltham in 1983. He was the fellow who was one of the drivers of the 1913 Glidden Tour race. Here's Walter Metz sitting in the Metz 1915 Model 22 Metz. We're making a movie of him, and he's speaking into the microphone. Here is Walter Metz. He was 90 years old at that time, 1983. We gave him a big banquet at the Holiday Inn, where 100 people attended, and unfortunately he passed away a year later. Great man. Some other people of the past we would like to talk about. John Robbins, the old superintendent. He worked for Marshall Moulton's auto dealership on Moody Street for a number of years. Then he joined W.H. Nichols as a draftsman. John Robbins, the superintendent, lived at Derby Street, 19-21 Derby Street, two-family house. And Charles Wolfe, another executive with the company, also joined the Marshall Moulton Ford dealership on Moody Street. What we have here is another one, a supplement slideshow, which we may show someday, where we go into the Orient buckboard 100%. Here you see Al Paquin, a 94-year-old former employee of the Metz company, on our title slide. Another one of our supplementary slideshows has to do with the Metz company is when the flying machines came to Waltham. Here we'll talk about that great week in Waltham when flying machines were performing for the first time before everyone in the city. The Waltham Museum, we're open every Sunday 1 to 4:30, and good night and good luck everyone.